I'd like to welcome all of you tonight to our presentation entitled The High Price of Bad Energy Choices with Jack Gibbons from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. This event's being held to help us understand just where Doug Ford's energy choices are leading Ontario and what we can do about it. My name is Sue McKenzie. I'm a member of Climate Action Muskoka and your host for this evening. On behalf of everyone present, I would like to acknowledge that we are settlers on lands from which Indigenous peoples were dispossessed by colonialism. Tonight, respectfully, we honor all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, for their cultures, their languages, their wise teachings, and their ways of being, their stewardship and protection of the lands, waters, and life that make up Turtle Island. We stand collectively for the struggle to return public lands to the stewardship of Indigenous peoples, to respect and uphold the proven spirit of the treaties, and to learn the truth about the historic relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers, such that we can build a relationship that is right and just. I'm coming to you here in South Muskoka. I'm on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Chippewa and the Ojibwa, and I recognize the more recent stewardship of the Mohawks of Wata, the Potawatomi of Moose Deer Point, and the Métis of the Moon River. Now, let me introduce you to the three groups sponsoring this webinar. Climate Action Muskoka is an inclusive, nonpartisan group formed in 2019 to drive climate solutions in the District of Muskoka. Through CAM's efforts, climate emergencies were declared unanimously by the district and 5 municipalities. CAM also promotes residential and business GHG reductions through its Community Carbon Challenge. And finally, of course, since September 2019, we can be found climate striking every week on the streets of Bracebridge, Huntsville, and Sundridge. Environment Haliburton is based in Haliburton, Ontario, and over the 17 years since its founding has kept environmental matters in focus in the community and has advocated, lobbied, educated, and acted as consultants on many environmental matters, including climate change. One of its founding members, Eric Lilius, is on the Zoom controls, and he has you all muted. You will meet Vice President Terry Moore later on in the meeting. Seniors for Climate Action Now was formed in mid-2020 and is a fast-growing organization of seniors dedicated to working with youth, Indigenous peoples, and other groups in the climate movement to achieve a clear vision of the climate emergency and to take decisive action to stop it. Now that we're all introduced, let's get a little business out of the way. Here's how the evening will shape up. SCAN member Joyce McLean will set the stage and introduce our main speaker, Jack Gibbons. Jack's presentation will be followed by a Q&A. We plan to wrap up by 9 p.m. We're very excited to announce that we're trying out a new feature tonight. Jack has agreed to stay for 20 minutes following the webinar. So we invite you to stay for our after chat with Jack. Terry Moore, a member of both Environment Haliburton and SCAN and host of the informative Planet Haliburton podcast, will moderate the chat box questions this evening. We respectfully request that you reserve the chat box for questions as they occur to you and refrain from personal conversations during the presentations. Well, I think that's everything. And now I'm going to hand the meeting over to Joyce McLean from SCAN to set the stage and to introduce our guest speaker. Joyce?
Okay, so I basically just want to set the stage before I introduce Jack to talk about how the Ontario electricity system fits into the overall emissions situation in Ontario. Oh no, I want to go forward. Oops. Let me go back one. Sorry about that. Sorry about all the changes. Okay, so where do our greenhouse gas emissions really come from? Well, they come from primarily from burning fossil fuels like oil and gas. So obviously that means cars, vehicles, trucks, heating our homes and buildings, industrial feedstock. When I say that, I mean, think Sarnia, think oil refining, that sort of thing, chemical industry, and the electricity sector. Excuse me. And if you break it down, it's approximately these percentages. So cars and vehicles are really a big part of our GHG problem in Ontario, and at about 35% of all these greenhouse gases in the province. Ontario industry is about 30%, or the second largest greenhouse gas source in Ontario. And our buildings produce about 22% of Ontario's greenhouse gas buildings. And when we say buildings, we're really talking about how we heat them and cool them. So when we look at the overall greenhouse gas picture in the province, about close to half comes from refining and refined petroleum products, and natural gas burning. And then when you look at the electricity box there, 16% is about the, that's the percentage of overall greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario from the electricity sector. So even though it's not the largest sector related to greenhouse gases in the province, what Jack is going to tell us is that this is going to be a growing problem. So while we're at 16% right now, that number is likely to climb. So when we look at that 16%, you know, our electricity comes from a variety of sources, and Jack will get into this in more detail, but that includes nuclear, hydroelectric, or water power, as I think it's clearer to say it that way because we often use hydro interchangeably, but really that means water power, wind, solar, biomass, and natural gas. So this is what Jack's talk is going to really focus on. So let me introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, Jack Gibbons, who is the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. He has worked on energy and environmental issues in the province for almost 40 years. And he's an economist by training, and he has been a project manager at the Ontario Energy Board, which is the regulatory agency in the province that manages our energy and our electricity systems. He was a former senior economic advisor for the Canadian Institute for Environmental Law and Policy, and I first met him when he was a commissioner at Toronto Hydro back in the 1990s. So he's schooled in economics from the University of Toronto, and he also went to Queen's, and he also went to UBC. So with that, without further ado, and my apologies for the fumbling at the beginning of this, I'd like to turn it over to Jack. And thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Joyce, for your introduction. And yes, we've both worked in the energy sector here in Ontario for many decades to try to move Ontario to a zero carbon electricity grid. And I recall that, you know, about 20 years ago, a giant wind turbine was built in downtown Toronto, thanks to your leadership. And I guess that was one of the first, or maybe the first, large wind turbine in Ontario. And it was a great symbol of hope and a vision for our future. And now, thanks to the work of you and people like Dalton McGuinty and many other people, we've got lots of wind turbines in Ontario. And as a result, last year, wind power provided Ontario with 9% of its electricity. And in fact, last year, we got more electricity from wind power than from our polluting gas-fired power plants. But we've still got a lot more work to do. And that's why it's great to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today about how we can work together to create a zero carbon electricity grid for Ontario by 2030, and also lower our electricity bills at the same time. But before we talk about how we can phase out our gas-fired power plants, it's important to highlight two key features of Doug Ford's electricity plan. Next slide, please. Now, the first key feature of Doug Ford's electricity plan is that he wants to ramp up the pollution from our gas-fired power plants by more than 600% by 2040. And the second key feature of his plan is that he wants to spend $28 billion on high-cost nuclear projects, which will push up our electricity rates and our electricity bills. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows the historic and forecast greenhouse gas pollution from our electric power plants, and it goes from 2005 to 2040. And so the good news is that thanks to the coal phase out, the greenhouse gas pollution from our power plants fell by 93% between 2005 and 2017. But since 2017, the pollution from our power plants has started to rise again and is forecast to rise by more than 600% by 2040. And that's the Government of Ontario's own forecast. And if that happens, we'll lose about half of the greenhouse gas pollution reduction benefits that we achieved by phasing out our dirty coal-fired power plants. Next slide, please. Now, this provides a breakout of how Doug Ford is planning to spend $28 billion on high-cost nuclear. First, he wants to spend $12 billion to rebuild the Darlington nuclear station's 4 aging nuclear reactors. Second, he wants to rebuild, sorry, no, keep on going in the wrong direction. Going in the wrong direction. Okay, stop there, please. Secondly, he wants to spend $13 billion to rebuild 6 of the Bruce nuclear station's aging reactors. And finally, he wants to spend $3 billion to build a new nuclear reactor in the GTA. The next slide, please. Now, Ontario's municipalities believe that Doug Ford is going in the wrong direction. And as a result, 32 municipalities have passed resolutions asking the Government of Ontario to phase out our gas-fired power plants. And these 32 municipalities represent almost 60% of Ontario's population. And they stretch from Windsor in the west to Kingston and Ottawa in the east, and up to Bracebridge and Sault Ste. Marie in the north. And the municipalities have made 2 specific requests to Doug Ford. First, please return the gas plants' pollution back to their 2017 level as soon as possible. And second, please achieve a complete phase out of gas-fired power by 2030. Next slide, please. Now, in response to the municipality's request, the IESO released a report last October about phasing out our gas-fired power plants. So who is the IESO? Well, that stands for the Independent Electricity System Operator. It's an agency of the Government of Ontario. And their job is to balance the supply and demand of electricity during every minute of the day to keep our lights on. And they're also responsible for the long-term planning of our electricity system. Now, the chair of the IESO is Joe Oliver. And you may remember him. He was the Minister of Finance in the Stephen Harper government. And he's a very well-known climate denier. So he's the head of the IESO. And so the IESO released their report last October in response to the requests of the municipalities for a gas power phase out by 2030. And according to the IESO report, it would be absolutely impossible to phase out gas-fired power by 2030. And they also said, if we attempt to phase out gas-fired power by 2030, our electricity rates will skyrocket and we will be subject to blackouts. So 3 very extreme claims, assertions by the IESO. The good news is that all of their claims are absolutely false. Next slide, please. So let's turn first to the IESO's claim that would be absolutely impossible to phase out gas power by 2030. So that's what they said. But when you look at the fine print of their report, they actually developed a plan to achieve a 99.7% zero carbon electricity grid by 2030. But then they went on to make the absolutely false and absurd claim that it would be impossible for us to meet the remaining 0.3% of our electricity needs in 2030 from carbon-free resources. And that claim is, just obviously false, because we all know that if we invest a bit more money in energy efficiency, if we invest a bit more money in wind and solar, if we import a bit more water power from Quebec or Manitoba, well, then absolutely by 2030, we could increase our supply of carbon-free electricity by 0.3%. So that's the first claim that they made that is absolutely false. Next slide, please. Now, the next claim they made was this irresponsible fear-mongering about blackouts. They said if we attempt to phase out gas power by 2030, we'll experience blackouts. And this is absolutely false, as the following facts indicate. Well, Ontario, the IESO has gas power plants under contract to provide power to the Ontario electricity grid. And by 2030, 33% of our existing gas-fired electricity generation capacity will still be under contract to the IESO. And even by 2040, some of our existing gas plants will still be under contract to the IESO. So what does this mean? It means that if in 2030 or 2033 or 2037 or 2040, if in any of those years in that decade, there is a temporary shortfall of our carbon-free electricity resources, well, we will not be subject to blackouts, because that's not what the IESO will do. If there is a temporary shortage of our carbon-free supplies, for whatever reason, what they will do is they will fire up the gas plants to keep our lights on. For them to suggest that they would willingly subject Ontario to blackouts when we've got those gas-fired power plants on standby reserve, it's absolutely irresponsible fear-mongering. Now, this is a type of fear-mongering that you would expect from a politician like Doug Ford. But the IESO, it's a provincial agency of civil servants that are supposed to be nonpartisan, and they shouldn't be engaged in this type of fear-mongering to try to sabotage the requests of 32 municipalities for a gas power phase-out. Next slide, please. But their fear-mongering isn't limited just to blackouts. They also engaged in fear-mongering about electricity rates. And in their report, they said that if we attempt to phase out gas power by 2030, then residential rates will rise by 60%. Rise by 60%. Well, when a normal person hears that residential rates are going to rise by 60%, they would assume that means that our costs of phasing out gas would increase our total cost of producing electricity by 60%. That's what you would think would be the driver of a 60% rate increase for residential customers. But in fact, that is not the case. According to the IESO's report, according to their analysis, a gas power phase out would only raise our electricity costs by 20%. But nevertheless, they put out a press release saying residential rates would rise by 60%. So they were saying that they think that the residential customers should pay 3 times their fair share for the gas power phase out. So again, irresponsible fear mongering about electricity rates. And if it was true that a gas power phase out would raise our costs by 20% by 2030, well, then a much fairer way to pay for it would be to raise residential, commercial, and industrial rates all by a uniform 2% each year between now and 2030. And that's how you could get a gas power phase out at a reasonable rate impact, just equal to the rate of inflation, if costs were actually going to rise by 20%. But as we will see in the next slide, even the IESO's claim the costs would rise by 20% is also false. Next slide, please. So the IESO report, when you look at the fine print, it predicts that a gas power phase out would raise our electricity costs by 20%. But again, that claim is false. It's fundamentally flawed, because what the IESO did to get this 20% cost increase is that they did 3 things. They did 3 things to allegedly inflate the cost of phasing out gas power. First, there's a carbon tax in Ontario, in Canada now, and it's going up each and every year. And if we phase out our gas-fired power plants, we're not going to have to pay as much carbon tax revenue payments. But they severely underestimated the carbon tax savings from phasing out the gas plants. Second, they ignored our 2 lowest cost storage options. Now, we all know that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So if you're going to have wind and solar, you also have to have a storage option. But they ignored the 2 lowest cost storage options for wind and solar in order to falsely inflate the cost of phasing out gas power. And the third thing they did to inflate the cost of phasing out gas power is that they're proposing to build a $3 billion new nuclear reactor in the GTA to phase out gas power. And they're proposing this option despite the fact that it is the highest cost option to keep our lights on. Next slide, please. So now I want to deal with these 3 ways that the IESO has inflated the cost of a gas power phase out. I want to talk about how they did this in a bit more detail. And so first, let's turn to carbon taxation. The IESO report assumes that in 2030, the gas plants will be subject to a carbon tax of only $50 a ton. And they made this assumption despite the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau has said very clearly that in 2030, the carbon tax will be $170 a ton. Then here's another thing they did. They assumed that in 2030, that only 5% of the gas plant's pollution would be subject to the carbon tax. So by making these 2 assumptions, they came to the conclusion that if we phased out the gas-fired power plants in 2030, we would only save $30 million a year. But if we assume instead that in 2030, the carbon tax is $170 a ton, as Prime Minister Trudeau has said it will be, and if we assume that 100% of the gas plants' pollution is subject to the carbon tax, then the carbon tax savings of phasing out the gas plants in 2030 would be $2 billion. $2 billion, not $30 million. So that's how they dramatically underestimated the carbon tax savings of phasing out the gas plants, and therefore overestimated the cost of doing so. Next slide, please. Now we come to storage. So as we know, wind and solar need a storage option. And our two lowest cost, we have two very low cost storage options, both of which the IESO's report completely ignored. They focused on much higher cost storage options. So first, our lowest cost storage option is Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs. According to a study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs are the lowest cost storage option for wind and solar energy. So here's how it would work. When we have surplus wind power, we would export the surplus wind power to Quebec to keep the lights on in Montreal. And as a result, Hydro-Quebec would be able to store more water in its reservoirs. Then when we have below average wind power, Hydro-Quebec would use that extra water power in its reservoirs to produce more water power for export back to Ontario. So that's how Hydro-Quebec can use its existing reservoirs as a storage option for wind and solar. That is our lowest cost storage option, but the IESO completely ignored it. And the second great storage option for wind and solar are our electric vehicles. Their batteries can store wind and solar energy when we have surplus wind and solar, and they can provide that power back to the grid on peak demand days when we need to phase out the gas-fired power plants. And this is a really important storage option because it's very low cost. The batteries are already going to be bought to power the cars, but they've got this option to provide this extra service to the electricity grid. And in order to harness our EVs batteries for the electricity grid, we have to install bidirectional chargers so that the people can use their EVs to provide power back to the grid. And this is a very important option because in 2030, the capacity of our electric vehicles' batteries will be more than double the capacity of our gas-fired power plants. So again, this is the second really important low-cost storage option that the IESO ignored in order to falsely inflate the cost of phasing out gas power. Next slide, please. And then finally, they inflated the cost of gas power by assuming that we should build a new nuclear reactor in the GTA at a cost of $3 billion, despite the fact that energy efficiency, wind and solar, Quebec water power can all keep our lights on at less than half the cost. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows the costs of Ontario's electricity resource options. And these options are energy efficiency, Quebec water power, wind and solar power, and nuclear power, and continuing to operate the gas plants. And the lowest cost options are on the left-hand side. Now, I want to draw your attention first to the bar graph in the middle with a cost of 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, that is the fuel and carbon tax cost of operating our gas plants in 2030, assuming that 100% of their pollution is subject to a carbon tax of $170 a ton. So that will be their fuel and carbon tax cost in 2030, 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So now look at all the bar graphs to the left of the 9 cent a kilowatt hour bar graph. And what you can see is that energy efficiency, Quebec water power, wind and solar can all keep our lights on in 2030 at a cost significantly lower than the fuel and carbon tax costs of continuing to operate our gas-fired power plants. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we can phase out gas-fired power in 2030 and lower our electricity costs and lower our electricity bills. So the truth is exactly the opposite of what the IESO claims. They suggest a gas power phase out by 2030 would raise residential rates by 60%. But if we invest in energy efficiency and renewables to phase out gas power, we can actually phase out gas power and lower our electricity costs, lower our electricity bills. Now, I would also like to turn your attention to the three bar graphs on the right-hand side, starting with the bar graph that has a cost of 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That is the price that we are paying today to Ontario Power Generation for its nuclear electricity, 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Now look at the bar graph with 13.7 cents. That's the price that OPG says we must pay OPG in 2027 for its nuclear electricity if we continue with the rebuilding of all four of its aging Darlington nuclear reactors. And finally, look at the bar graph with a cost of 16.3 cents a kilowatt hour. That is what the nuclear industry says will be the cost of power from a new GTA nuclear reactor. Okay, so what this slide shows is that nuclear power is the highest cost option to keep our lights on. So what does this tell us? It tells us that if we invest in energy efficiency and renewables to not only phase out the gas power plants, but also to reduce our need for high-cost nuclear, then we can achieve further bill reductions. So basically what the slide shows is three important messages. It tells us if we invest in energy efficiency and renewables, then we can phase out gas-fired power by 2030. It tells us we can reduce our need for high-cost nuclear, and it tells us that we can lower our electricity bills. So that's the good news story. And so if the IESO and Doug Ford really wanted to reduce our electricity rates, if Doug Ford really wanted to reduce our electricity bills by 12%, like he promised during the 2018 election, then they would be very aggressively promoting energy efficiency and renewables. But unfortunately, they're not. They're doing exactly the opposite. They're ramping up our polluting gas-fired power plants, and they're proposing to spend $28 billion on high-cost nuclear, which will just push our electricity rates further up. Next slide, please. So clearly, the IESO needs to go back to the drawing board and to develop an unbiased, fact-based least cost plan to return our gas plants' pollution back to their 2017 level as soon as possible, and also to achieve a complete gas power phase out by 2030. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of returning the gas plants' pollution back to their 2017 level as soon as possible, well, we've got a three-point plan to do that. The first point is to ban gas-fired electricity exports to the United States. That is an option that could dramatically reduce the pollution from our gas plants instantaneously. If we did that tomorrow, their pollution would fall dramatically. And this is a very important option because last year, our electricity exports exceeded the total output of our gas-fired power plants. So this is an action that Doug Ford could take tomorrow to dramatically reduce our gas plant pollution. The second thing he can do is he can double our imports of low-cost water power from Quebec using our existing transmission lines. Last year, with our existing transmission lines, we could have doubled our imports of water power from Quebec if we wanted to, but we chose not to. So again, this is an action that Doug Ford could take tomorrow to dramatically reduce our need for the polluting gas-fired power plants. Just double our imports from Quebec using the existing transmission lines that are there and are not operated at full capacity. So these are two very easy options that could be implemented tomorrow to give us a dramatic reduction in the pollution from our gas-fired power plants. And the third option is that we should be investing in all our energy efficiency and all our solar and wind power options that can keep our lights on at less than the cost, less than the price we are paying to OPG for nuclear electricity, which is 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. As you saw in our chart, energy efficiency, wind and solar can all meet our needs at a cost way below 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So if we were to pursue this three-point plan, then we could very quickly return the gas plants pollution back to their 2017 level. Next slide, please. But in order to achieve a complete gas power phase out by 2030, there are two additional things we have to do, because the demand for our gas-fired power plants is at its greatest during those hot summer days when our air conditioners are running full out and during the very cold winter nights. And in order to completely phase out the gas-fired power plants on those days, we need to do two additional things. We need to expand our transmission links with Quebec so that we can import more water power from Quebec on those hot summer days. And we can expand our transmission links, our transmission capacity with Quebec using existing Hydro One transmission corridors. We don't have to build new transmission corridors, but we can just upgrade the capacity of the existing corridors. So that's what we need to do in addition. And secondly, we need to install the bidirectional chargers in our homes, in our office places, in our buildings, so that our electric vehicles, our electric cars, our school buses, our electric school buses, our electric delivery vehicles can provide power back to the grid during peak demand hours to help phase out the gas-fired power plants. Next slide, please. And finally, we have to deal with this fear-mongering with respect to blackouts. As I've already told you, as you know, the IESO engaged in fear-mongering. They suggest that we would have blackouts if we attempted to phase out the gas-fired power plants. And I've explained to you why this was absolutely irresponsible and untrue. But that type of fear-mongering is a very powerful political club that could be used during the election by the IESO or Doug Ford to attack Andrea Horwath or Mike Schreiner when they call for a gas power phase out by 2030. And so we absolutely have to take this political club away from Doug Ford and the IESO. And there's a very simple way to do that. And that is to just say that OPG must be directed to put its 5 large gas-fired power plants on standby reserve between 2030 and 2040. That means they're on standby reserve. So if for any reason there is a temporary shortage in our carbon-free resources, then the gas-fired power plants can be fired up to provide emergency backup power to our electricity grid. And so if we do that, then we can promise the people of Ontario, and Andrea Horvath and Mike Schreiner can promise the people of Ontario that we can phase out gas power by 2030 with absolutely no risk of blackouts. All we have to do is say OPG's 5 large gas plants must be on standby reserve to provide emergency backup if for any reason there is a temporary need for them. Next slide, please. So I want to recap the progress we've made so far. We launched our campaign for the phase out of gas-fired power by 2030 back in February of last year at a meeting that was in Hamilton, sponsored by Environment Hamilton and Hamilton 350. And in the last 2 years, we've made a lot of progress. As I've noted before, over 32 municipalities have called for a gas power phase out. In addition, over 60 citizens groups have called for a gas power phase out by 2030. Andrea Horvath and Mike Schreiner have both called for a gas power phase out by 2030. Prime Minister Trudeau has promised to create a zero carbon electricity grid for Canada by 2035. And even our Ontario's Minister of Energy, Todd Smith, after he read the fundamentally flawed IESO report, he sent the IESO back to the drawing board to develop a plan to phase out the gas plants. Now, unfortunately, there's 2 problems with with Todd Smith's directive. He didn't specify a date by when the gas plants should be phased out. He should have said by 2030. And he also, he told the IESO, and don't report back to me until after the election. Next slide, please. So the provincial election, it's just 92 days away. So here are our priorities between now and the provincial election. It's to communicate to the public and to the media and to our political leaders that we can phase out the gas-fired power by 2030 and lower our electricity bills. And we want to work to persuade both Stephen Del Duca, the leader of the Liberal Party, and Doug Ford to promise to phase out gas-fired power by 2030. Next slide, please. So in order to be successful, to get Stephen Del Duca and Doug Ford to endorse a gas power phase out by 2030, we need your help. We need the help of everyone on this line who's watching this Zoom meeting tonight. And here's some things you can do. First, you can sign our petition calling on Doug Ford and Stephen Del Duca to call for a gas power phase out by 2030. You can go to our petition at ontarioclimateaction.ca and sign it, pass it on to your friends. You can see on the right-hand side the cover of our pamphlet about the gas plant pollution increasing by more than 600%. You can go to our website and order this pamphlet and distribute it to your friends and neighbors. And you can also sign up for our electronic newsletter so you can get regular bulletins from us. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
Thank you for that, Jack. I think that you probably raised dozens of questions in people's minds that they're going to want to flood the chat with for the next 45 minutes or so. So I want to just take this time before we move on to those questions is to remind people that the chat box is open, and if you've got any comments or questions that you want to put to Jack, please put them in the chat box as soon as you can. And I'll come to those in just a minute. As was alluded to by Sue, we actually have a first commenter or first questioner that we've lined up. in the person of Brian Nash. Brian, I hope you're on the line. I think you called in basically saying you were en route. Oh, there you are. Perfect. Okay, so Brian is a founder of Haliburton Solar and Wind in Haliburton County, and is now taken a bit of a step back from the day-to-day operations of that particular entity, and he is a renewable energy consultant here in Haliburton County, but he branches out well beyond those borders. And so we wanted to reach out to Brian, given his expertise and his background, and also his current position on the County of Haliburton's climate change, community climate change planning advisory group, to ask the first, make the first comment and ask the first question. So Brian, over to you.
Well, thanks, Terry. Jack, it's a great presentation. Thank you very much for that. I've got a few questions, but the first one that comes to mind is GridWatch, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's an online tool the IESO provides, so you can watch the energy mix in context of generation every second of every day, if you like, online. So just before the meeting, I went and checked on GridWatch, and just before the meeting started, we were putting 46% of our generation and consumption out of nuclear and 26% from gas. So those two sources of generation seem to be in your presentation fairly contentious in context to how you were noting the cost of these entities in terms of their generation capacity and ongoing maintenance, i.e. nuclear. So when we're looking at two specific generators, nuclear and gas, representing currently, just tonight, 72% of all the energy that's going into our grid, how do you imagine creating the means to replace that?
Well, it's by investing in the much lower cost and cleaner alternatives. You know, we've got a huge untapped energy efficiency potential. As our slide show, it costs just on average about 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour. There's a huge potential there. There's a huge potential to import low-cost water power from Quebec, and we can ramp up wind and solar. And so these are the options. At the moment, you know, last year, gas provided us with 8% of our electricity, and certainly by 2030 we can replace that with these other options.
Does the Clean Air Alliance work? Does the Clean Air? I just have a quick follow-up question. Do you? I know from the industry, and I was down at the Electricity Transformation Conference for Canada back in November with lots of industry folks and the tons of great keynote panel sessions, etc. The biggest obstacle, the entire industry. I mean, let's just imagine for a moment, pretend that we could replace that capacity with solar and wind. The regulatory burden to bring over a megawatt of solar to a grid connection point, it takes anywhere from 3 to 7 years to move through that regulatory burden before you can put feet on the ground to install it. So how do we imagine that regulatory process being changed to accommodate what you're reflecting?
Well, I disagree that there's that regulatory burden. I mean, we can put solar on our rooftops in a few months. It doesn't have to take that long. I mean,
okay. Yeah.
It absolutely doesn't have to take that long. It certainly doesn't have to take anywhere near that long to build more wind power. And as I've pointed out, with a flip of a switch, we could be doubling our imports of water power from Quebec tomorrow. And with a flip of a switch, we could be cutting off our gas-fired electricity exports to the United States tomorrow. There's lots of things we can do. At last year, gas provided us with just 8% of our electricity. And so, if we pursue these lower cost options aggressively, and we can do it. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned, like 20 years ago, Joyce got a wind turbine built in downtown Toronto. And at that time, it was like the first wind turbine or one of the first large wind turbines. But, now we've got lots. And, wind now provides us with 9% of our electricity. And we've done that already. And so now we just have to replace gas, which at the moment is 8% of our electricity. So we can do it by a combination of more wind, solar, lots of energy efficiency, Quebec water power, and using our electric vehicles' batteries as a storage for wind and solar, as well as Quebec's reservoirs. Quebec's got this huge surplus of water power. Last year, the average price that Quebec got for water power was just 4 cents a kilowatt hour. That was their average price, their average export price, 4 cents a kilowatt hour. But we're paying 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour for nuclear electricity. I mean, it just if we were economically rational and environmentally rational, we would be buying as much Quebec water power as we could. But we don't, because Doug Ford and the IESO, they're not committed to lowering our electricity bills or lowering our greenhouse gas pollution. Their goal is to protect the profits of Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power and the gas-fired power companies. That's what their motives are. But if we had a premier in place that actually wanted to lower our electricity bills and to create a zero carbon grid, well, we've got lots of great options to do it.
Okay, Brian, I suspect that we've got lots more to discuss around the edges of what you were talking about. Maybe not around the edges, maybe closer to the middle. So, I think I would invite you, if you're able to chip in later on if we have a deficit of questions in chat, or if you're able to stay for the after chat. I'd love to be able to get into some of the weeds with respect to some of the issues that you're raising. Right now, what I'd like to do is thank you for your question, your comment, your question, and then move on to some of the other issues contained in chat. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so John Smith asks what the cost of bidirectional charges will be, and that will be needed to be installed in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even the millions in our homes. Also, is it realistic to expect that vehicles to be attached to these in time at the time of day for when the demands are the highest?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And virtually all of the chargers that are being installed now are unidirectional. They can power our electric vehicles, but they don't allow the electric vehicles to return power back to the grid. And so at the moment, we're not mass producing bidirectional chargers. So they're done on a custom basis, and they are higher cost. But people in the industry believe that if we mass produce bidirectional chargers, their costs will not be significantly higher than unidirectional chargers. So we have to create a market for it. And because the bidirectional chargers will allow us to harness those electric vehicle batteries, and which are a very low cost option, because the batteries are already paid for to power the cars. So the incremental cost for the electricity grid is just the cost of the bidirectional chargers. Now, you raised the question, well, will the cars be available to provide power back to the grid when they're needed? Well, the good news is that the cars are parked for 95% of the hours of the year. So will every car be available to provide power back to the grid when we need it? No. And we're not suggesting that the car should be forced to provide power back to the grid. But what we are saying is that when the grid needs power, there will be a lot of cars that are parked that could provide power back to the grid. And so we should install these bidirectional chargers so they will have that option to do so. And obviously the owners of the electric vehicles should be financially rewarded for providing power back to the grid at peak time. So this will be a voluntary program that would reward people who own electric vehicles for helping the grid phase out the gas-fired power plants.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Jack. Another question that's in chat, but I don't know exactly who it's from, is who owns the transmission lines between Ontario and Quebec? Are these a federal responsibility? So when Trudeau promises a zero carbon grid by X date, who's really in charge here? Is he able to make that kind of promise and make it stick? Or does it involve provincial jurisdiction? Exactly who's in control of that file?
Well, both the federal and the provincial government have jurisdiction on these issues. In terms of the transmission lines, virtually all of Ontario's transmission lines are owned by Hydro One, which is a corporation that is owned partly by the government of Ontario and partly by the private sector. But they own virtually all of our transmission capacity in Ontario. And so what we're saying is that they should expand their links with Hydro-Quebec, which runs the transmission system in Quebec. So they need to be given that direction, and the Premier of Ontario needs to make a deal with Quebec. But the federal government also has a role, because Prime Minister Trudeau has promised to establish a clean energy standard for the electricity sector that will require the Canadian electricity grid to be a net carbon zero by 2035. And he has the authority to do that because he has the authority to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution. That's being, upheld by the Supreme Court. So he also has the authority to force Ontario to move to a carbon-free electricity grid. And the Prime Minister Trudeau has established the Canada Infrastructure Bank to finance infrastructure projects. And he has told the Canada Infrastructure Bank that they should be financing projects to expand the east-west transmission grid. So that's something that they should be doing. They should be financing the expansion of the east-west transmission grid. But unfortunately, that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has gone a bit off the rails. And instead of providing financing to expand the east-west transmission links between Ontario and Quebec, they are instead planning to provide a huge low-interest loan to Fortis Inc., a big private sector electric company, to build a new transmission line to ship the gas-fired power from Ontario under Lake Erie to the United States. And if this transmission line gets built, it will just facilitate more exports of Ontario gas-fired electricity to the United States. So unfortunately, Prime Minister Trudeau's Canada Infrastructure Bank is just going in totally the opposite direction. It's supposed to be supporting Prime Minister Trudeau's actions and desire to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, but it's proposing to provide financing for a project which will increase greenhouse gas pollution here in Ontario. So that's unfortunate, and it would be great if people could contact Prime Minister Trudeau and their Liberal MP, if they have one, or Dominique LeBlanc, who's the Minister of Infrastructure.
So Louise Brownlee has put a comment in chat asking, what are the politics associated with not buying hydropower from Quebec?
Well, the politics are very clear. Buying Hydro-Quebec is low-cost water power, low-cost surplus water power, very clean. And, it's buying it would be good for electricity consumers here in Ontario, good for our environment, good for our businesses that would have lower electricity rates. But it's very, very strongly opposed by our Ontario electric utilities. Ontario Power Generation, which is owned by the government of Ontario, Bruce Power, which operates the Bruce Nuclear Station, plus all the gas-fired power companies, they are absolutely terrified of competition from Hydro-Quebec, because they know if Hydro-Quebec is allowed to compete on a level playing field, they will lose market share. That is, the nuclear companies and the gas companies here in Ontario, they'll lose market share and profits. So the Ontario gas power companies are electricity separatists. They have been promoting for years and years electricity separatism. They say we absolutely must not trade with Hydro-Quebec. It's morally wrong to import low-cost Quebec water power, but they have no problem importing all of the uranium for our nuclear reactors from Saskatchewan, and they have no problem importing frack gas from Western Canada and Pennsylvania to power up our gas-fired power plants. But it's absolutely wrong, according to them, to import clean, low-cost, renewable power from our next-door neighbor in Quebec.
During your presentation, you mentioned both the leader of the Green Party of Ontario and the leader of the New Democratic Party with respect to them having taken a position on the gas power phase out, gas plant phase out. But you indicated that Stephen Del Duca needs to be lobbied in order to go in that direction. Do we know what the provincial Liberal policy is with respect to the gas plant phase out?
Well, no, they haven't released their policy yet. Stephen Del Duca, to the best of my knowledge, has not released his platform on virtually any issue yet. And so, you know, we're doing our best to persuade him to make phasing out gas power by 2030 part of his one of his campaign promises. And so we're working very hard to do that. You know, we would expect Stephen Del Duca and the Ontario Liberal Party to be a leader in terms of smart actions to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution. You know, his two predecessors, Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, were very strong supporters of fighting climate change. Prime Minister Trudeau is certainly, you know, got a policy of moving Canada to a zero carbon grid by 2035. And, you know, that's a challenging target for Canada, 2035, because Saskatchewan and Alberta, you know, they get 70 to 90% of their electricity from fossil fuels. But today, Ontario only gets 8% of its electricity from fossil fuels. So it's very reasonable for Ontario to lead Canada once again and to commit to phase out, to create a zero carbon electricity grid by 2030. So we're hoping that Stephen Del Duca will be a climate champion, just like Dalton McGuinty was and Kathleen Wynne was. But again, you know, we need your help. 92 days till election. Please, you know, sign our petition calling on Stephen Del Duca to endorse a gas power phase out by 2030. And please, you know, if you meet any of your local Liberal candidates, please raise this issue with them and tell them, you know, it's very important to you.
Somebody was asking in chat about whether or not if someone could put in the chat box the connection to the petition. So I noticed that I think someone from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance who does social media is actually on the in the meeting today. So I'm wondering whether or not he could actually post that connection into the chat box. That would be helpful, I think, to people who are attending tonight's meeting.
Yes, so it's OntarioClimateAction.ca. But
okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. OntarioClimateAction.ca.
Yeah.
Okay. Lori Bothwick is asking where she can find a list of the 32 municipalities that are on board with the gas phase out by 2030.
Okay, well, it's on our website. If you go to our homepage, at the top, there's a 1 and a 2 and a 3. But if you go below the 1 and 2 and 3, and there's something about further action about phasing out gas-fired power plants. And if you go to that part of the website, you can find the list of the municipalities. But if our social media person, Kelly's on the watching this Zoom call, maybe he can find the link and put it in the chat box too.
Okay, so John Cohen asks, can you show, or can you, I guess, tell us how much of the peak and average loads are carried by gas versus hydro and nuclear, solar and wind, and how these would change without gas power?
Okay, so last year gas provided us of 8% of our of our total electricity supply. But in terms of on the peak demand days, in the peak demand days in the summer, it was almost 7,000 megawatts. And the peak demand hours in the winter, it was maybe almost 6,000 megawatts. And so again, the most difficult time to phase out the gas plants will be on the hottest summer days and the coldest winter nights. And to do that, we've got to have these extra transmission links with Quebec. Quebec is a winter peaking system. They've got a huge surplus of water power in the summer, and that surplus water power in the summer could easily replace all of our gas-fired generation in the summer. And in the winter, we've also got to harness our electric vehicles batteries to provide power back to the grid. And again, there's this huge potential from our electric vehicles batteries, because by 2030, the capacity of our electric vehicles batteries will be more than double the total capacity of our gas-fired power plants, which is about 10,500 megawatts. So these are the things we have to do. We have to expand the transmission links with Quebec, and we have to be a leader in terms of electric vehicles and installing bi-directional chargers so that our electric vehicles can do two things. One, clean up our transportation sector, and two, help us phase out our gas-fired power plants. And that's another way of how Ontario can become a leader in EV technology. And it's so key that we become a leader in EV technology if we want to protect our automobile industry.
Louise Brownlee asked a second question, which has to do with the cost to Ontario of giving up gas exports. What would that cost be? I don't know if you mentioned that exactly during your presentation, and who would bear those costs?
Well, yes, we do make a profit margin on the gas-fired electricity exports, and I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you it would be very minor in terms of the total picture. Our total costs of electricity in Ontario, generation, transmission, and distribution, is over $20 billion a year. And the profits that we would make from the gas-fired electricity exports would be very small. But you may want a more precise answer. And the agency that can tell you that is the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator. And I think if I asked them, I'm not sure. I don't think they would tell me. And that's why I haven't asked them. But I would encourage you to ask them to tell us what are the profits that we make from the gas-fired power plants exports. And that will be an important piece of information, but I'm very confident it'll be a very small amount. And so just ending these gas-fired electricity exports is a quick, and I'm no doubt in my mind, a very low-cost way for us to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution. But it's a good question, and the IESO, which is a public agency, should provide that information to you.
Okay, so Peter Nicholas is asking a question about how the costs have escalated since the 1990s in terms of electricity from various sources, including from nuclear, from thermal, coal, and oil, and so on and so forth. He says that these costs have essentially been flipped and inflated since the 1990s. And he asks, how did they get to where they are now?
Well, absolutely. The costs have gone up a lot. And, part of it is a major part. The single largest component of our rising cost of electricity generation is nuclear power. In terms of the rise in our costs of electricity generation since 2002, about 50% of the rise in the cost is due to nuclear power. Our decision to rebuild the nuclear reactors that were shut down in 1998. In 1998, 7 of our nuclear reactors were shut down for safety reasons. All of those reactors were shut down for at least 5 years. we did rebuild 5 of them, and that was expensive. And now Doug Ford's got this plan to rebuild 10 more nuclear reactors and build a new nuclear reactor in the GTA, and that's got a bill of $28 billion. So what we've been doing is we've been, pursuing the highest cost options to keep our lights on, and our budgets for energy efficiency and renewables are now minuscule. Doug Ford is spending $0 on a new wind and solar. He's not negotiating deals with Quebec for low-cost water power, despite the fact that it's less than half the cost of nuclear power. And in terms of energy efficiency, he's reduced the IESO's energy efficiency budget by more than 60%. So what's the IESO spending on energy efficiency? Less than $200 million a year. On the other hand, Doug Ford wants to spend $28 billion on high-cost nuclear. What we are doing is economically irrational.
Okay, John Smith asks another question having to do with your comment during your presentation, but we could flip the switch tomorrow and import more power, low-cost power from Quebec. He's basically asking more, I guess, for more detail with respect to the east-west transmission network, and that's been talked about for decades, but it hasn't actually gone all that far. And he's asking how can the imports from Quebec be increased at a time when there's not the kind of east-west transmission grid that's created that would facilitate it? Is it as easy as you put it during your presentation that we could flip a switch tomorrow and import significantly increased quantities of power from Quebec?
Well, yes, because we do have transmission lines with Quebec now. We have 7 or 8 interconnections with Quebec now. These interconnections are along the Ottawa River, in the city of Ottawa, and along the St. Lawrence. Like there's interconnections like at Cornwall, at Beauharnois, on the St. Lawrence. So we've got 7 or 8 interconnections now with Hydro-Quebec, but they're not used to full capacity. Last year, they were just used at approximately, less than 50% capacity. So we can more than double our imports with the existing transmission lines. So, I mean, we absolutely should be doing that if we were economically rational and if we actually wanted to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution instead of increasing it by 600%. But in addition, we should import even more water power from Quebec because it's so low cost. And so we're saying we should build new transmission lines. And the IESO has done studies on where we could build new transmission lines. And they've identified 4 locations where we could build new transmission lines. They're on the Ottawa River and on the St. Lawrence to increase our transmission capacity, import capacity by an extra 7,500 megawatts, which again, 7,500 megawatts is more than the peak demand, the peak use of our gas-fired power plants on our hottest summer days or our coldest winter nights. So those expansions should be made. And, if Doug Ford could get financing, low-cost interest financing from Prime Minister Trudeau's Canada Infrastructure Bank to do it. I mean, so it's just so obvious, and the low-cost financing is there. If there was just the political will, it could happen.
Okay, so there's 2 questions here, one from Richard White and one from Peter Nicholas, where they're asking about your reference to the modeling, I think, that was done, or the study that was done by MIT, having to do with the utilization of Quebec reservoirs as a kind of a storage to cover off the intermittency of renewables. And so that's one question: is how well is that modeled, and how confident are you that in fact that capacity is there? And secondly, how does that match on to the peak demand periods during a day when people are wanting to get home and so on and so forth after work? Does it match up the storage capacity with the time we actually need it?
Well, absolutely. The Quebec reservoirs, they're just gigantic. And the modeling's been done by MIT and by other people. And I don't think any expert would question that there's this huge capacity. We are so lucky to be located right next door to Quebec, which gives us this huge, which has these huge reservoirs, which can act like a giant battery. So we're very fortunate because of our geography. There's no question Quebec's got this huge battery. Hydro-Quebec's been very clear that it wants to be the green battery for solar and wind for Eastern North America. And so it's there for the taking. But, again, the roadblock is Ontario's policy of electricity separatism, this refusal to pursue these low-cost options. And again, it's because the IESO and Doug Ford are captured by our nuclear industry and our gas-fired power companies that don't want competition from Quebec, and they don't want to talk about it.
Okay, there's a related question having to do with Quebec's Gentilly hydro stations not being built, or I guess maybe being built to supply U.S. Demand. And is there a problem with it being committed in terms of long-term contracts into other places besides Ontario?
Well, at the moment, virtually all of Hydro-Quebec's exports to the United States are on the spot market. They have very few long-term contracts with the United States. Now, they have been trying to negotiate some with the United States, but their problem is they don't have the transmission capacity. And there's many people in the United States that are opposing the building of new transmission lines to bring power from Quebec to the States. So the long-term contracts that they've negotiated with American states, they may not come to fruition because the transmission lines may not be built. But nevertheless, even so, Quebec does have still has power available for export to Ontario. And again, they do have these huge reservoirs that we can tap into. And Quebec also, has huge potential to increase their exports of power both to the US and to Ontario for a couple of reasons. One, Quebec's electricity consumption per person is the highest in the world. And so they've got the tremendous potential to invest in energy efficiency in Quebec to free up even more of their heritage hydro capacity for export to Ontario or the United States. And in addition, Quebec has this huge untapped potential of low-cost wind power. So again, if Ontario wanted more power from Quebec, or the United States did, there's beyond Quebec's existing surplus, Quebec could develop wind power for export to Ontario and to the United States.
Okay, so there's two questions that are related to hooking up bidirectional charging capacity for electric vehicles. One has to do with what would the impact be on massively converting to electric vehicles in the first place in terms of electrical demand, and whether or not we could meet that. And secondly, having to do with the people who are connecting their electric vehicles to the grid. Is there any, does that have an impact on the longevity of their electric vehicle batteries? And will that have a downside for people connecting to those bi-directional grids?
Okay, so in terms of people connecting to the grid, when people connect their electric vehicles to the grid, we want to encourage them to connect to the grid at night or on weekends or on holidays, because the demand for electricity is much lower at night than during the day. So if people charge up their electric vehicles at night, then we don't have to build new generation capacity or new transmission capacity to supply them. So that's what we want to encourage. And then we want to encourage them to provide power back to the grid, during the daytime, during a peak. That's how we want to do it. And another important fact about electric vehicles, like we all know that we need to move to electric vehicles to clean up the transportation sector. And many people imagine that if we go to electric vehicles, that's just going to have an absolutely tremendous impact on our total demand for electricity. But that's not the case, because many people don't realize that electric vehicles are much, much more energy efficient than gas-powered vehicles. And so if all of our cars were to become electric vehicles, that would only increase our total demand for electricity by 17%, which I think is much less than most people sort of intuitively think. And I think there was a second part to that question, but I've forgotten it now.
It had to do with whether or not there's a downside for anybody hooking up to that bi-directional kind of charging relationship with the grid, whether or not there's a downside in terms of battery longevity for the car.
Well, that certainly is being an issue that, people have raised, but I think that problem is going away. There's, a number of car manufacturers are now making their cars so they can provide power back to the grid. And for example, and the best example is the Ford Motor Company with their new Ford 150 Lightning pickup truck, this electric pickup truck. If you look at the Ford's advertising for it, one of the key features of this advertising is that this truck can power your house in terms of blackout for up to 10 days. So electric vehicle batteries are now being developed so that they can not only power the car or the truck, but also provide power back to the grid.
Okay, so there's a comment in chat about the fact that back in the 1980s, it was calculated that 5 more picking A plants would be required to actually charge and to support electric vehicles. I take it what you're saying from what you've just said, that number is exaggerated.
Well, it certainly sounds exaggerated. And again, that's, some people I'm sure will argue that we should build nuclear reactors to charge our electric vehicles. We don't think that makes sense, because wind and solar and Quebec water power can charge our electric vehicles at a much, much lower cost.
Okay, and there was a comment asking about, or a comment and a question having to do with climate change and the vulnerability of Quebec's hydroelectric system to climate change, and whether or not it will be as reliable as the climate gets more extreme.
Well, I haven't seen any studies to suggest that that Hydro-Quebec system's more vulnerable to climate change than other technologies like wind or solar. And certainly in terms of nuclear, we now use the Great Lakes to cool the nuclear reactors, and I certainly think some people believe that with climate change and hotter lakes, it will be more difficult for the Great Lakes to cool our nuclear reactors. Okay,
we're getting really close to 9 o'clock, and so I think what we should probably do is end this part of the discussion and then move with a bit of a break into the after chat that Sue was talking about at the beginning of the meeting. So I just want to take this opportunity to remind people to continue to put comments and questions into the chat, and if we haven't had a chance to focus on those during this part of the meeting, we hope to get at those during the after chat that Jack has agreed to do for about 20 minutes after the formal close of the evening. So thank you, Jack, for your presentation. Thank you for for answering the questions that you have so far, and look forward to you sticking around for the after chat where we can get into the weeds on a few other issues. So thank you very much. So I'll turn this back to Sue for some final comments.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming, and I especially want to thank our two presenters, Joyce for setting the stage up for us, and Jack for giving us the information we need to respond to the myths that are out there. We hear them every day. about not being able to achieve the phase out, and about blackouts and rising costs, and for outlining for us very clearly how we can achieve this vital role. So I really urge anyone who hasn't yet signed the petition to call for the phase out to go ahead and do that. The link was in the chat. And also lobby your municipality. If they haven't joined the call, if they're not one of the 32, then lobby those municipalities to call for the gas-fired power plant phase out. And I'd like to invite you to stay for the after chat. And I'd like to let you know that tomorrow a resource list will be coming out to all the people who attended. And also a recording will be available a little bit later, so it'll follow along once it's edited. Okay, so please, if you want to stay around, we'll be a couple of minutes as if people wish to leave or go and pour themselves a little drink for the evening or whatever, and join us for the after chat with Jack. Good night.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yes, excellent, Jack. Wow.
It's
Thank you.
great. I just went on the Ontario Clean Air Alliance.org. I couldn't actually get on the website. It said that the website couldn't be reached or something.
Oh dear, cleanairalliance.org, you couldn't get there?
Yeah, that's it, Jack. I had that trouble earlier this week.
I tried it
Oh dear.
both Safari and Chrome. So I was going to copy the link for the petition into the resource list.
Yes.
But
What is it again, Jack?
OntarioClimateAction.ca.
Ontario Climate Action. Thank you.
And don't forget, don't put Ontario in front of Clean Air Alliance. It's just cleanairalliance.org.
Oh,
So it's .org, not .ca.
Yeah, the main
Okay. I'm hoping
website for
that
these
was the
guys.
reason why you couldn't get to it.
Yeah.
I don't like to hear that our website's not working.
No, it's working fine. I was just on it.
Great.
I must have put Ontario in front of it. That's probably why.
Yeah.
Right. It's a natural thing to do.
okay.
That's what it was called.
Yeah.
Who's watching the 2 minutes? Give them another minute or so.
Yeah, we got 1 minute left. I'm sort of watching it. It's Terry.
Okay, thanks, Terry.
Well done, Jack. Thank you.
Hey, Joyce.
Oh, I'm gonna have to watch it again. And we had two, Jack. Can everybody hear us or just us?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Okay, thank you.
You said you had 2 Jack Gibbonses? Yeah, I think I know why that happened. Martin Bush sent me an email just before the meeting started saying, can you send me the link? So what I sent him my link, the link you had sent me. So I guess we both use that same link to come on.
And you asked yourself a question then.
Did I?
Okay, I guess we're back now for the, and Terry, you'll be moderating again.
Sure, I can do that. So welcome, everybody. From my list here, it looks like 36 people or so have hung around for the after chat. So thank you for doing that. And I want to invite you to continue to put your comments into the chat box. There's a few more people than I feel comfortable with, or we feel comfortable with, just simply opening up and unmuting everybody, because our experience has been is that creates a lot of over talking. So I think I would encourage you to continue to use the chat box to put any further questions in it or comments, so that we can carry on the conversation with Jack for another 20 minutes or so. So I'm just looking and scrolling through that right now and see what we didn't cover before that we may be able to pick up immediately. So So one question that Tony Patterson put in chat, because I haven't thought about this at all, is Quebec's power bounty and surplus energy dependent on Churchill Falls and an agreement with Newfoundland?
Well, yes, Quebec gets a lot of power from Churchill Falls, and that contract does expire around 2040. And so, yes, after 2040, we may be wanting to do a deal with Newfoundland instead for some of that power. I mean, the power is going to be there. And after 2040, I think it's reasonable to assume that Newfoundland will get a much better price for that power that it's getting today. But they're going to want to sell to someone. And, the transmission links will be there between Newfoundland and Ontario now, thanks to Hydro-Quebec's transmission system. So yes, after 2040, if we will have the opportunity to buy that power directly from Newfoundland, and we should do so.
Okay. Are there any municipalities? I know there's been something in chat with respect to some parts of Ontario, for example, Eastern Ontario, Cornwall in particular, getting its hydropower from Quebec already. Are there places in Ontario which do get access to Quebec power and at any significant level that helps to lower costs in their jurisdiction?
Well, yes, Cornwall is the lucky city. And Cornwall has got 100% of its electricity from Hydro-Quebec for 50 years. And Cornwall has the lowest electricity rates in Ontario. And so, Cornwall is a great shining example of the benefits of importing low-cost water power from Quebec. And it's also important to remember, remembering back to the 2003 blackout, it took Ontario more than 8 days to get our power system back to full power because of our dependence on nuclear reactors that were hard to restart. Whereas in the 2003 blackout, the lights never went out in Cornwall. So they've had a great deal with Hydro-Quebec for 50 years. And they just, show that, Hydro-Quebec is a reliable, good source of power. And, if the little city of Cornwall can make a very advantageous deal with Quebec, well, then certainly Ontario, which is a much bigger market to offer, should be able to also negotiate good power deals with Quebec.
Okay, so just to follow up on that for a second, Jack, I mean, to what extent can Cornwall be reproduced? So is it in a particularly unique set of circumstances in terms of owning its own utility? I mean, how is it able to put itself in a position where it can buy cheap power from Quebec and has done so for 50 years? In distinction to, say, other places within Ontario, how has it been able to pull this off?
Well, Cornwall is just across the St. Lawrence from Quebec or the United States. What happened, I believe, Hydro-Quebec was providing power to a large industrial facility, either in Ontario or in the United States. And then that facility closed down, and then they had the transmission lines. And then there was this opportunity to instead supply the city of Cornwall. And the city of Cornwall, at the time, they owned their own public electric utility, Cornwall Electric, that was smart enough to make that deal. So the Cornwall situation is a special historical example. Now, many people say, well, look, why doesn't Hydro Ottawa make a similar deal with Quebec? Well, they might like to, but the government of Ontario doesn't want them to do that. And so they put in special regulations for all. And you see, Cornwall is allowed to do this because the city of Cornwall is not connected to the Ontario power grid. It is just connected to the Hydro-Quebec power grid. But for the city of Ottawa and all the other municipalities that are connected to the Ontario power grid, the government of Ontario has special rules that basically say, if you make a deal with Hydro-Quebec for power. Well, yeah, you could go and buy it, but we're going to still charge you the global adjustment charge to pay for Ontario's nuclear plants and Ontario's gas plants. And because the global adjustment charge is so high, it wouldn't be in the financial self-interest of Hydro Ottawa to do a deal with Quebec, because in addition to paying Hydro-Quebec for their water power, they'd have to pay the global adjustment charge to pay for the nuclear plants and the gas plants, even if they weren't using them at all. So, the government of Ontario realized there was a potential for other municipalities to maybe want to do a deal with Quebec, so that they wrote the rules so there would be a financial penalty, so they won't want to do it.
Right. Now, you'll know that Ford has recently committed or directed, I guess, either the IESO or Hydro to investigate expansion of water power in Northern Ontario. What's the capacity for being able to expand, hydro capacity in the north? And what would the environmental consequences of such an expansion be?
Well, we do have, there is the technical capacity to expand hydropower in the north, but just from a financial perspective, it'll be very expensive. And so it doesn't make economic sense to build any significant new hydro capacity in the north, because it's so high cost. And you remember, our power plants, are now owned by Ontario Power Generation. It owns the nuclear plants and a lot of the hydro plants and a lot of the gas plants. But Ontario Power Generation, it used to be called Ontario Hydro. And the old Ontario Hydro, in the first 50 years of the last century, it developed all our low-cost hydroelectric resources. And then by the end of the 1950s, it had developed all our low-cost hydroelectric resources. So it started building large coal plants and then large nuclear plants, because we had tapped out all of our low-cost water power resources. So basically, that's the story. We've tapped out virtually all of our low-cost water power resources. So yes, we could develop more water power in the north, but it's a very high-cost option. And so it doesn't make sense to do that, given that energy efficiency and wind and solar can meet our electricity needs at a much, much lower cost.
I take it that a large part of the cost has to do with transmission from where it would be generated. That's
yeah, absolutely. That would be a large cost, but also the generation costs would be good, because they're not really great sites. And a hydro facility, the cost effectiveness really depends on the geography, and the geography in Northern Ontario is not good. Is not very good for water power. And so that means it's expensive. Plus there will be the huge cost of the transmission lines bringing the power south. So it's not cost effective. The world has changed a lot. Now, according to the International Energy Agency and many other reputable organizations, wind and solar is now are now the world's lowest cost sources of new supply. And so that's where we should be putting our money in terms of new generation facilities in Ontario. We got to be focused on the solutions that are good for the 21st century. Water power was a great option for Ontario in the first half of the last century, but now we've tapped out our low-cost water resources.
So Jennifer Penny in chat wants to go back into the conversation for a bit about the vulnerability of power coming of hydroelectric power. She's thinking about a couple of examples of blackouts that took place during extreme weather events, for example. She's thinking about one in Ohio, and I'm not sure where the other one is, but in any event, what do you think, how do you think about the vulnerability of transmission systems, to, under conditions of growing extreme weather events, that we're going to face with increasing temperatures?
Well, sure, there are risks, and there's no solution, there's no electricity solution that is perfect. There's no solution that's risk-free. And certainly we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. We should have a diverse supply mix. I think it makes sense to, as part of our mix, to include water power from Quebec, but we also should be investing, in solar and wind. And we've got our own water power resources in Ontario. We got, about 24% of our supply today from water power. So yes, we want to invest in these different options. And, solar can be on our rooftops and hence not be vulnerable to problems with the transmission system. And again, for electric vehicles, batteries, that's a good storage option that can give us additional security of supply, during extreme events.
Okay, so there's a comment about energy efficiency in chat. Nick DiCarlo has raised the question about, it is a very low cost alternative to every, it's the lowest cost. I think it was 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour or something. But you also indicated that that the government of Ontario has made a low priority out of investments in energy efficiency. So if you were able to deliver a message with respect to what the potential is and where we should concentrate our efforts with respect to on the energy efficiency side, where would you point as to be the most important things for strategic investments to make that happen?
Well, there's so many things. I mean, there's thousands of every time we use electricity, there's a potential for every use that we use electricity for, there's a potential for increased energy efficiency. So there's lots of things we should be doing, and we're suggesting that the IESO should put out an offer, to pay people for energy efficiency savings. But one good example, for residential customers is, we got about 450,000 homes, single family homes in Ontario that are electrically heated. And, we could reduce, we did a study about installing air source heat pumps in these electrically heated homes. And our study showed that, that's a very, very cost-effective option. If you install air source heat pumps in all the electrically heated homes, well, they could reduce the homeowners' electricity costs by up to $1 billion a year. For the typical home, it could be about $2,100 a year savings in their electricity costs. And so this is a great option. Air source heat pumps are like about 200 to 300% more energy efficient than electric baseboard heating. So that would be a great program that the government should have to provide financing for air source heat pumps for all of our electrically heated homes. It should be, it should be no down payment financing and zero interest financing, so that a person, there's going to be no upfront capital cost barrier to a person installing a heat pump, and if they do it, they can pay for it on their electricity bill for 15 years. But because there's no down payment and because it's zero interest, the homeowner will see a net reduction in their electricity bill, even with the cost of paying for the heat pump in the first month that it's installed. So, in terms of energy efficiency, that's a great thing we could do. And if all of our electrically heated homes had heat pumps, that would reduce the greenhouse gas pollution from our gas plants by 18% in 2030.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day about the alternative, which is that I suppose not the alternative, but what the Ford government's doing instead is subsidizing the extension of natural gas into rural Ontario. and that the cost of that on a per unit basis is something like $27,000. And in comparison, the numbers that you're talking about for a much lower per unit, investment, what we could achieve is a very substantial energy efficiency saving and cut our greenhouse gas emissions at the same time.
Well, absolutely. Doug Ford's providing huge subsidies to expand our fossil gas system in rural communities, and it's very, very expensive. And if instead he would subsidize the installation of air source heat pumps in our electrical heated homes and our rural homes that are heated by oil or propane, well, then he could provide the homeowners with a much bigger reduction in their home heating bill. And he could also actually reduce their greenhouse gas pollution at the same time. So again, it's just another example of Doug Ford, pursuing policies to promote fossil gas that are irrational from the point of view of both the consumer and also bad for the planet.
Okay, so Jack, you've managed to last until 9:20. So I want to thank you very much for staying for the after chat. You've done a great job, I think, in terms of presenting, the case for, for the phase out of the gas plants, and you've answered a lot of the questions that people have put in chat with respect to the implications associated with that. So I want to thank you once again for joining us and doing the presentation, but also joining us for the after chat. Thank you very much. I appreciate this, and I hope you'll come back.
Oh, absolutely, Terry, anytime. And thank you so much for organizing this Zoom call, this webinar, so we can work together to get the message out, and hopefully we can all work together to get Stephen Del Duca and Doug Ford on side. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You take care.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good to see you again, Jack.